The crowd in Riverside Table fell silent, their chatter fading into uneasy whispers. All eyes were on Edward Harper, the elderly man now standing at the entrance of the restaurant, his worn red MAGA cap perched firmly on his head. His shoulders were straight, his chin lifted, not in defiance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered far worse storms in his life. Moments earlier, Edward had been seated at his usual spot by the window, enjoying the sunlight and the aroma of freshly baked bread. Now he stood outside, gazing at the horizon as if to steady himself. He didn't say a word as he walked away, leaving a palpable tension lingering in the room. What had just happened inside? What could make a man like Edward Harper, a retired Navy officer who had served his country with honor, leave so abruptly and with such profound silence? The answer was as simple as it was complicated: his red MAGA hat. But this wasn't just a story about a hat. It was about a clash of values, hidden prejudices, and an act of quiet defiance that would ripple through this small town and far beyond. Brookhaven was a picturesque riverside town, its cobblestone streets lined with colorful shops and friendly faces. Among its landmarks was Riverside Table, a bustling restaurant loved for its home-style cooking and cozy charm. But while the food kept customers coming back, the management often left them divided. Dylan Carter, the restaurant's manager, was known for his rigid policies and outspoken nature. To him, inclusivity meant eliminating anything he deemed divisive, whether it was a slogan on a T-shirt or, in this case, a bright red hat. Many saw his approach as admirable, but others whispered about how it often veered into intolerance. Edward Harper had only recently moved to Brookhaven after decades of service in the Navy. At 72, he carried himself with a quiet strength, his weathered hands and lined face telling a story of sacrifice and resilience. The red MAGA cap he often wore wasn't just a statement, it was a piece of his identity, a reminder of the values he believed in: freedom, determination, and pride in his country. While he knew the hat stirred strong opinions, for Edward, it wasn't about politics, it was about principles. On the day everything changed, Edward walked into Riverside Table as he always did, his signature cap drawing a few glances but no comments. He greeted the hostess with a polite nod and made his way to his favorite table by the window. He had barely opened the menu when Dylan approached, his expression tight. "Sir," Dylan began, his tone clipped, "we have a policy against political attire in this restaurant. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat, or leave." Edward looked up, his calm blue eyes meeting Dylan's. "This isn't political," he said quietly. "It's a symbol of who I am." "It's making others uncomfortable," Dylan replied, his arms crossed. "We have to maintain an inclusive environment." A hush fell over the nearby tables as patrons turned to watch the exchange. Edward didn't raise his voice or argue. He simply stood, adjusted his cap, and left a few dollars on the table for his untouched coffee. And as he walked out, the murmurs began. Some whispered in agreement with Dylan, others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if what they'd just witnessed was right. What would you have done in Edward's shoes? Was Dylan protecting his policy or was he crossing a line? Let us know your thoughts. Outside the restaurant, Edward Harper paused for a moment on the sidewalk. The brisk November air stung his cheeks, but he didn't mind. It helped mask the flush of quiet humiliation he felt. He adjusted his red MAGA hat with steady hands, a motion that was more about preserving his dignity than the hat itself. He took a deep breath, glanced back at the restaurant, and then began the short walk home. Inside Riverside Table was a hive of whispers. Some diners were uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. "That man didn't deserve that," an elderly woman murmured to her daughter. "He wasn't hurting anyone." But others nodded approvingly, believing Dylan Carter had done the right thing by enforcing his no political symbol policy. Dylan, however, felt a twinge of unease as he returned to his office. He told himself it was just another tough decision as a manager, but something about the veteran's quiet dignity made him hesitate. Meanwhile, Edward's son, Ryan Harper, sat miles away in his city apartment, scrolling through his phone after finishing an editorial piece for his online column. Ryan was a prominent journalist, known for his razor-sharp insights and millions of followers who eagerly awaited his posts, when his phone buzzed with a message from a family friend. A photo of Edward standing outside Riverside Table, looking resolute but alone. Ryan felt his chest tighten. Accompanying the image was a brief caption. "Your dad was asked to leave because of his hat. He didn't want me to tell you, but I thought you should know." Ryan stared at the screen, his blood boiling. He dialed his father immediately. "Dad," he began, his voice tight. "What happened at that restaurant?" Edward's calm reply only fueled his anger. "It's not a big deal, son," Edward said. "I didn't want to cause a scene." But Ryan couldn't let it go. "Not a big deal? They disrespected you, Dad, after everything you've done for this country." Edward tried to reason with him, but Ryan's mind was already racing with ideas. The next morning, Ryan posted a video recounting the incident. His tone was calm but firm, his words laced with an unmistakable passion. "My father, a retired Navy officer who served this country for over 30 years, was asked to leave a restaurant yesterday. Not because he was causing trouble, not because he was being disruptive, but because of the hat on his head. A hat that represents his beliefs, his identity, and his service to this nation." Ryan held up a photo of Edward in uniform, his younger self standing proudly on a Navy deck. "This man fought for the freedoms we take for granted, and yesterday, those freedoms were denied to him in a place he thought was safe." The video spread like wildfire, amassing millions of views within hours. Comments flooded in, some outraged, others supportive of the restaurant's decision, but most condemning the treatment of a veteran. How could they do this to a man who sacrificed so much? One commenter wrote. Another added, "Freedom of expression doesn't stop because someone feels uncomfortable. This is wrong." Back in Brookhaven, the video reached Riverside Table. Dylan Carter watched it in his office, his stomach sinking with every word. The restaurant's social media pages were already inundated with angry reviews, accusations of intolerance, and calls for boycotts. Regular patrons began canceling reservations, and by lunchtime, the dining room that was usually bustling with activity was eerily quiet. Dylan's employees exchanged worried glances, some whispering about whether this was the beginning of the end for their once-beloved restaurant. But the real storm was only just beginning. Reporters descended on Brookhaven, eager to cover the controversy. Stories from former employees began surfacing online, painting Dylan as a rigid, often overbearing manager. One ex-server wrote anonymously, "This isn't the first time Dylan's policies have hurt people. He uses inclusivity as an excuse to push his own biases." Another added, "I remember him forcing a customer to leave for wearing a shirt he didn't like. It's no surprise this happened." The incident became a nationwide debate, touching on issues of free expression, respect for veterans, and the thin line between inclusivity and discrimination. As for Edward Harper, he remained quiet through the uproar, going about his days as usual. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: gratitude for his son's support, discomfort at being the center of attention, and a lingering sadness at how easily people judged others without understanding their story. For Edward, the hat was never about division. It was about identity, resilience, and pride in his country. Yet somehow, that simple piece of fabric had become a lightning rod for controversy, one he never asked for but could no longer avoid. Edward Harper sat on his porch that evening, the fading sunlight painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. His old wooden rocking chair creaked softly beneath him as he gazed at the quiet street. The uproar over the incident at Riverside Table had grown louder than he ever anticipated, and while Ryan had acted out of love, Edward couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He wasn't a man who sought conflict. His decades of service had taught him the value of restraint and perspective, of knowing when to fight and when to let go. The simplicity of his life now, a life of quiet moments and small acts of kindness, was enough for him. Yet here he was, unwillingly thrust into the spotlight, his image plastered across social media, news outlets, and even talk shows. The hum of a car pulling up to the curb drew Edward's attention. Ryan stepped out, his jaw set and determination in his eyes. He climbed the steps and sat down beside his father, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. "Dad," Ryan began softly, breaking the silence. "I know you didn't want this to blow up, but people need to see what's happening. This isn't just about you. It's about what you represent." Edward sighed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, son, but the world doesn't need another argument over something as simple as a hat." Ryan leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. "It's not just a hat, Dad. It's about respect. Respect for you, for your service, and for the values you stood for. What they did wasn't right, and people deserve to know that." Edward's gaze shifted to the horizon, his voice calm but firm. "And what happens after they know? What changes, Ryan? Do you think shouting louder will make people listen, or will it just drive them further apart?" Ryan fell silent, the weight of his father's words sinking in. Edward reached over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "The world is already divided enough. I've lived long enough to know that sometimes dignity isn't about winning. It's about standing tall and letting the storm pass." Ryan nodded slowly, but the fire in his heart wasn't so easily extinguished. The two sat in silence for a while, the crickets chirping in the growing dusk. Before Ryan left, Edward added one final thought. "Just promise me this, whatever you do next, don't do it out of anger. Do it out of purpose." The next day, Ryan took his father's words to heart as he prepared his follow-up post. He sat at his desk, a blank document glowing on his laptop screen. The emotions he felt, anger, frustration, love, were still there, but Edward's steadying presence had given him a new perspective. When Ryan's post went live, it struck a different tone. "This isn't about canceling a restaurant or tearing someone down," he wrote. "It's about learning to listen, to see beyond symbols and judgments. My father didn't walk out of that restaurant because he was angry. He left because he knew dignity isn't about shouting back. It's about knowing who you are and standing by it. Let's not use this moment to divide further. Let's use it to reflect on how we treat each other, no matter what we believe." The post resonated deeply, drawing thoughtful responses from people on both sides of the debate. Comments began shifting from outrage to introspection. "This really made me think," one user wrote. "We need more conversations like this." Another added, "Your dad's grace is inspiring. Thank you for sharing his story." Even Dylan Carter saw the post. For the first time since the incident, he felt a pang of guilt he couldn't ignore. He had stood firm on his policy, but now he questioned whether it was truly about inclusivity or simply his own biases. That night, Dylan closed his office door, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. The words of Edward's son lingered in his mind. "It's not about anger. It's about purpose." The days that followed were quiet, but something had shifted. Conversations sparked in Brookhaven and beyond, about respect, understanding, and the gray areas between right and wrong. And while Edward Harper returned to his life of quiet service, the ripples of his silent defiance continued to spread, reaching places he would never see, touching hearts he would never know. Dylan Carter sat alone in the dimly lit dining room of Riverside Table, long after the last customer had left. The once lively space felt hollow now, the clinking of plates and laughter replaced by silence. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts churning. Ryan Harper's words echoed in his mind like a distant drumbeat. "It's not about anger. It's about purpose." For years, Dylan had convinced himself he was doing the right thing, enforcing policies to maintain an environment where no one felt excluded. But now, he wondered, had his version of inclusion actually excluded someone who deserved the utmost respect? He couldn't shake the image of Edward Harper walking out of the restaurant, his back straight, his dignity intact. It haunted him. The guilt felt heavier that night than it ever had. He opened his laptop and searched Edward Harper's name, expecting to find little more than news articles and angry posts about the incident. What he found instead left him breathless. There were pictures of Edward in his younger days, standing aboard a naval ship with his crew, their camaraderie evident in their wide smiles. There were accounts of his tours overseas, detailing his bravery in moments of unimaginable danger. Dylan read about the medals Edward had earned, not for the recognition, but because he had put his life on the line to save others. And then there were photos of Edward at local events, always wearing that same red hat, standing next to veterans half his age as he raised funds for those in need. Dylan leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a man with a hat. This was a man who had lived a life of honor, who had given everything to ensure others could enjoy freedoms they often took for granted. And Dylan had asked him to leave, over a symbol he barely understood. The realization hit him hard. His chest tightened as shame began to replace the self-righteousness he'd clung to for so long. Dylan knew he couldn't undo what he'd done, but he also couldn't ignore it. He had to make it right, not for the restaurant, not for his reputation, but for Edward. The next morning, Edward Harper was back at his usual routine. He volunteered at the community center, helping a group of young veterans navigate the often overwhelming transition back to civilian life. His calm presence and gentle words offered them a sense of stability, a reminder that they weren't alone. As he wrapped up for the day, he stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, only to find Dylan Carter standing by the center's entrance. Dylan's expression was a mixture of determination and vulnerability, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Mr. Harper," Dylan began, his voice faltering. Edward raised an eyebrow, recognizing him immediately. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Edward gave a small nod, his face neutral. "Not at all," he said, though there was no warmth in his tone. "What brings you here?" Dylan hesitated, swallowing hard before he spoke again. "I came to apologize for what I did, for how I treated you." His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. "I made assumptions about you, about what your hat stood for, without even trying to understand. I thought I was protecting people, but all I did was disrespect someone who's done more for this country than I ever will." Edward studied Dylan carefully, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally said, "An apology is a start, Mr. Carter, but it's just words until you show me what you'll do differently." Dylan nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief that Edward hadn't turned him away outright. "I will," he promised. "I've already started making changes at the restaurant, revising our policies, training the staff to focus on empathy and understanding. But more than that, I need to change myself, and I know that'll take time." Edward's gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. If you're sincere, then you'll find the way forward." Dylan extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Edward shook it. The handshake was brief, but carried a weight that neither man would soon forget. As Dylan left, Edward stood watching him go, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. He knew Dylan's journey was just beginning, but the fact that he'd taken the first step was enough, for now. Later that evening, Edward sat with Ryan on the porch, the two of them wrapped in comfortable silence. Ryan broke it first. "Dad," he said softly, "I saw Dylan today. He reached out to me too." Edward glanced at his son, his expression thoughtful. "And what did you say to him?" Ryan exhaled deeply, his hands clasped together. "I told him I'm not ready to forgive him yet, but I also told him I respect that he's trying." Edward nodded slowly. "That's a good start. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Ryan. It means letting go of anger so you can move forward." Ryan looked at his father, admiration shining in his eyes. "How do you do it, Dad? Stay so calm, so steady, even after everything?" Edward smiled faintly, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Because I've learned that life isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you respond. And I've seen enough to know that the only way to win is to hold on to your dignity, no matter what." The two of them sat quietly as the stars began to appear, the weight of recent events slowly lifting. In that moment, they both understood something profound. It wasn't the hat or the policies or the arguments that mattered. It was the choices they made, to stand tall, to listen, to forgive, and to grow. And that, Edward thought, Was the legacy worth leaving behind? In the following weeks, the small town of Brookhaven found itself at the center of a larger national conversation. News outlets picked up the story of Edward Harper and the incident at Riverside Table. It was no longer just about a hat or a policy. It became a symbol of the fine line between personal expression and societal values. Panels on television debated the situation. Social media teemed with both outrage and reflection, and for a time, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Through it all, Edward stayed grounded. He didn't engage with the frenzy swirling around him, choosing instead to focus on what mattered: his family, his community, and the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. But despite his calm demeanor, he couldn't help but notice the changes taking root around him. Dylan Carter had thrown himself into his own journey of accountability. True to his word, he implemented sweeping changes at the restaurant. The staff underwent new training that emphasized empathy and understanding, and the rigid no symbols policy was replaced with a more thoughtful approach that prioritized dialogue over exclusion. Dylan even reached out to veterans organizations, offering the restaurant as a venue for fundraisers and events. The efforts didn't erase the backlash, but it showed sincerity, and slowly, some patrons began to return. One Saturday afternoon, Dylan held a community event at the restaurant, a tribute to local veterans. Edward received an invitation but wasn't sure if he'd attend. Ryan encouraged him. "You don't have to go, Dad, but if you do, it might show people what real strength looks like." After some thought, Edward decided to attend. When he arrived, the restaurant was abuzz with activity. Veterans of all ages mingled, sharing stories and shaking hands. Dylan was there, moving nervously through the crowd, ensuring everything went smoothly. When he spotted Edward, he froze for a moment before walking over. "Mr. Harper," Dylan said, his voice hesitant but earnest. "I'm glad you came." Edward looked at him, his face neutral but calm. "You've put a lot of effort into this," he said simply. "I have," Dylan admitted, "but I know it doesn't erase what happened. I just hope it's a step in the right direction." Edward nodded, and for the first time, his expression softened into a faint smile. "It is," he said. "It's a good step." The two men shook hands again, but this time the gesture felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of the past. Dylan introduced Edward to several attendees, and as the event went on, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a gathering, it felt like healing, a community finding its way back to common ground. As the evening wound down, Ryan arrived to pick up his father. He lingered near the door, watching Edward interact with the crowd. Veterans shared their stories with him. Kids listened intently as he spoke about his time in the Navy, and even Dylan's staff seemed eager to engage with him. Ryan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. On the drive home, Ryan glanced over at his father. "That was powerful," he said. "You being there, it meant something." Edward chuckled softly. "Sometimes, Ryan, the best way to teach is just to show up and listen." In the days that followed, the storm of attention around the incident began to settle. The town of Brookhaven found its rhythm again, but something had changed. Conversations felt a little more thoughtful, people a little more patient. The incident at Riverside Table had forced everyone to examine their assumptions, not just about others, but about themselves. For Dylan, the journey was far from over, but he continued to work toward becoming a better leader and person, using his mistakes as a foundation for growth. For Ryan, the experience deepened his resolve to stand up for what was right, but with a new understanding of the value of grace. And for Edward, life returned to its quiet simplicity, where moments with family and acts of service remained his true legacy. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Edward Harper reflected on the events of the past few months. The world, he thought, could always use a little more listening, a little more understanding. And if his story could inspire even a small ripple of change, then perhaps the turmoil had been worth it. What would you have done if you were in Edward's shoes or Dylan's? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, respect, kindness, and understanding aren't just ideals, they're responsibilities we all share. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time with another story that challenges, inspires, and reminds us of what truly matters. Several months had passed since the community event at Riverside Table. Life in Brookhaven returned to its gentle rhythm, but for those involved in the now famous incident, the lessons continued to unfold. Dylan Carter, still managing the restaurant, had become a quieter, more introspective leader. The changes he implemented, empathy workshops for his staff, open discussions with patrons, and a more welcoming environment were gaining traction. Yet he still wondered if he had truly earned forgiveness, especially from Edward Harper. One evening, as Dylan was locking up the restaurant, he saw a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk. Edward. The old veteran seemed to hesitate before stepping forward, a small envelope in his hand. "Mr. Carter," Edward said, his voice steady but kind. "I wanted to stop by and thank you." Dylan blinked, caught off guard. "Thank me? For what?" Edward handed him the envelope. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "Thank you for taking the time to listen, to change, and to create a space where people like me feel seen. It's not the changes you've made to this restaurant that matter most. It's the changes you've made in yourself." Dylan felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked up at Edward, struggling to find the words. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Edward replied with a faint smile. "Just keep going. That's all any of us can do." The two men stood in silence for a moment before Edward tipped his hat, a gesture that now carried a deeper meaning, and turned to leave. Dylan watched him go, the note still clutched in his hand. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Meanwhile, Ryan Harper's advocacy work had taken on a new direction. Inspired by his father's quiet strength, he launched an online campaign called Project Dignity, dedicated to promoting dialogue and understanding across political, cultural, and generational divides. The campaign encouraged people to share stories of reconciliation and growth, using the hashtag #ListenAndLearn. It quickly gained traction, with thousands of people contributing their own experiences. One story in particular caught Ryan's attention: a young server at Riverside Table who had witnessed the original incident. She wrote about how the fallout had forced her to confront her own biases, and how Dylan's transformation had inspired her to be more compassionate in her daily interactions. Ryan showed the post to his father one afternoon, hoping it would resonate. Edward read it silently, his expression thoughtful. "Seems like people are learning," Edward said finally, setting the phone down. "That's a good start." Ryan nodded. "Yeah, but there's still so much to do. Sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we try, the world just keeps pulling apart." Edward placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The world's always been like that, Ryan. What matters is that we keep trying. Change doesn't come all at once. It comes in small steps, one person at a time." Ryan looked at his father, a newfound determination in his eyes. "I think you've inspired more change than you realize, Dad." Edward chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe the world just needed a reminder that dignity speaks louder than anger." Months turned into a year, and Brookhaven continued to heal. The restaurant thrived under Dylan's new leadership, becoming a space where differences were respected and stories were shared. Edward Harper remained a pillar of the community, his presence at town events and veterans gatherings a source of quiet strength. On the anniversary of the incident, Riverside Table hosted a special dinner honoring local veterans. Edward was the guest of honor, seated at a long table surrounded by fellow servicemen and women. Dylan, now far more comfortable in his role as a leader, stood to give a toast. "To Mr. Edward Harper," Dylan said, raising his glass, "for teaching me and all of us that true leadership starts with humility and the courage to change." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Edward allowed himself a small smile of pride. As he looked around at the faces, young and old, familiar and new, he felt a profound sense of hope. The world wasn't perfect, but moments like these reminded him that progress was possible. As the evening wound down, Edward and Ryan stepped outside together, the cool night air crisp against their skin. The stars above were bright, the kind of stars that only small towns like Brookhaven could offer. "You think things are finally settling down?" Ryan asked, his tone lighter than before. "Maybe," Edward replied, gazing up at the sky. "Or maybe this is just the beginning." The two men stood there for a while, side by side, their silence filled with understanding. In the distance, the soft hum of laughter and music spilled out of Riverside Table, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it truly sounded like home. As time moved on, the ripples of what happened at Riverside Table spread far beyond Brookhaven. Dylan Carter continued to grow, becoming a more thoughtful leader and a genuine advocate for understanding in the community. The restaurant flourished, not because of its menu or decor, but because it had become a symbol of change, a place where people of all walks of life felt welcome. Ryan Harper's Project Dignity expanded nationwide, becoming a platform for people to share stories of reconciliation and personal growth. Through the campaign, countless individuals found the courage to confront their biases, listen to opposing views, and seek common ground. Ryan, though still a fiery advocate for justice, carried with him the grace and patience his father had taught him. As for Edward Harper, his life returned to its quiet simplicity. He spent his days volunteering, mentoring younger veterans, and enjoying time with his family. The red MAGA hat remained on his head, not as a statement of defiance, but as a symbol of his journey, of resilience, dignity, and the unshakable belief that every individual deserved respect. On a sunny spring morning, Edward received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Dylan. The letter was brief but heartfelt, thanking Edward for his patience, his grace, and the lessons he had taught, lessons Dylan admitted he hadn't known he needed. "You didn't just change me, Mr. Harper," it read. "You changed the way I see the world, and for that I'll always be grateful." Edward folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, alongside other mementos of his life, photos of his family, his medals, and letters from friends and comrades. It was a small gesture, but to him, it meant the world. That evening, Edward sat on his porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Ryan joined him, a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas for his next campaign. The two men sat in companionable silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. "Dad," Ryan said, finally breaking the quiet, "do you ever wonder if all of this, the incident, the fallout, the conversations, was meant to happen?" Edward considered the question, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just what happens when you stand your ground. Either way, I'm glad we made it through." Ryan nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Me too." As the stars began to dot the evening sky, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. His life had been one of service, of sacrifice, of lessons learned and shared, and while he hadn't asked to become a symbol of anything, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts, standing firm, staying calm, showing grace, could leave the biggest impact. The world would keep spinning with its conflicts and challenges, its divisions and reconciliations. But for Edward Harper, that night on the porch with his son, everything felt just as it should. And perhaps, he thought, that was enough.